Hello and welcome to Billy's Craft Room. This tutorial is part of my online workshop series, Adventures in Acrylics. For more information about this, please visit the blog. In today's film, I'd like to show you how to create an embossed stone paint effect. This technique works on the small size, but it also scales up well to A5 or above. It's perfect for surface decoration and makes wonderful book covers. For this project, you will need Daler-Rowney texture paste, acrylic paint. I'm using Winsor & Newton Galleria, which is their Flow Formula acrylic paint. The colours I'm using are Payne's Grey, Burnt Sienna and Raw Umber. You'll need a jar of water, a tin plate to mix the colours on, a small plastic bag, a piece of cotton rag to clean up, a palette knife. I find these flat ones useful. You'll also need some unprinted newspaper. You will also need some heavy cardboard that's been embossed. This could be pre-made, or I've created this using a Cuttlebug embossing folder. I won't show how to do that in this film, but I will add a link to an earlier film where I showed how to do that. The surface I'm working on is a craft sheet, which makes it much easier to clean up at the end. Take a generous amount of the texture paste and apply this over the raised side of the embossed panel. You want a generous layer, but you don't want to fill in all of the embossing. You still want to have the raised areas visible. Once you've got a coat of paste on there, go back over and skim off the excess. You can put any unused paste back in the jar. If you can't clean the palette knife immediately, make sure you put it in a jar of water so that the texture paste doesn't dry on it. I'm now going to add some texture using the plastic bag. Scrunch it up, and while the texture paste is still wet, dab over the surface. You'll get a different amount of texturing depending on how wet the texture paste is and how hard you press. So do experiment, and if you prefer, you could also use scrunched up paper in place of the plastic bag to create this texture. I'm going over pretty much the whole surface of this piece because I want it to have a stone-like effect. But this is also a great technique to apply just in small areas where you particularly want texturing. Continue to add the texture until you have an effect that you like, and then set it aside to dry completely before you move on. Now the paste is dried, the colour I'm going to add is Payne's Grey. I'm going to apply the paint using the scrunched up newspaper. I'm using this because it's nice and soft, and because it absorbs the paint slightly. You don't apply too much. I found this works even better than the sponge on this particular effect. Dab into the paint and then dab off the excess on the side of the plate. Starting on the very edge of the paper, begin to tap the paint onto the project. I start at the very edges just in case there is a heavier application of paint than I intended. By applying the paint very gently, it's picking up on the raised areas of the design. This is the embossed pattern, but also a small amount of the texturing is coming through as well. Continue to add the colour until you have an effect that you like. Here's how my piece looks at this point, and you now need to set it aside to dry completely before you move on. Now that the earlier layer has dried, I'm going to add some burnt sienna. Again, I'm going to apply this using the scrunched up newsprint. Start at the edges, just in case you pick up more paint than it's intended, and then gradually work in towards the middle. This just warms the piece up a little bit. I'm only going very gently with this, and it's quite amazing how much the texture it picks up. Here's how the piece looks at this point. As you can see, I've only put a very small amount of the paint on there, but it does help. Once again, set the piece aside to dry completely before you move on. Now that the earlier colours have dried, I'm going to go in with a very small amount of raw umber. This is a semi-transparent colour, but you still don't want to put too much on there. I'm just trying to add a little bit of depth and dimension by adding some shadowing with this colour. Always start at the edges, just to make sure you're not putting too much paint on. And once again, just catch areas here and there. This is highlighting the stone effect texture, as it's picking up the very fine texture that was applied with the plastic bag. As ever, continue adding colour until you have an effect that you like. Here's how the piece looks. As you can see, the really fine texturing on there has been highlighted nicely by the paint. Set this piece aside to dry completely before you do anything else with it. I've created the piece on thinner card so that I could run it through a Cuttlebug embossing folder, but you do need to mount it onto more sturdy paper when you actually want to use it on a project. Here are some other examples that I made using the same technique. This one, the colours are quite a bit brighter. This one I'm going to put onto some mount board to use as a book cover. This one's come up quite a bit paler. I really like the shabby chic vintage look this one's created. Now, believe it or not, this one started out the same way as the others. If you find you do put more paint on than you intended, it can get out of hand. So what I did to save this piece was to put a colour wash over the whole piece of Payne's Grey. This was acrylic paint that I added extra water to. I then added some interference paint and some metallic paint on there as well. It's come up a lot darker and a lot more grungy. Jury's still out as to whether it's mud or magic. What do you think? Have fun, experiment, and I'd love to see your results if you try this technique yourself. See you next time for more adventures in acrylics. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, do leave me a comment. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye bye. For more inspiration, please visit the blog on www.billiescraftroom.co.uk.